All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be hosting Dr. Laurel Paget-Seekins here today at our weekly seminar. Laurel is coming to us from Oakland, where she's been working as a fellow in the Leadership in Government Fellowship with the Open Society Foundation. Before that, she was with the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, first working as a director in the Office of Performance Management and Innovation, and then as the Assistant General Manager for Policy. Her academic background includes a PhD from Georgia Tech, and then she works as a postdoc. I'm also focusing on public transit in Santiago, Chile, with a connection to Munich, or was it the position in?
I had two postdocs, one was in Munich.
Perfect. She'll tell us a little more about her career trajectory, which I'm sure all of you guys are excited to hear about. And with that, I will turn it over to Laura.
Hello, it's so exciting to be somewhere in person. Done a lot of Zoom presentations in the last few years. It's the first time I've been doing an in-person one, but also so I'm going to do sort of a premise of my presentation, talk through like 4 major components, and then do some sort of reflections and then tell you a little bit about what I've been up to during this past fellowship year, which is just ending. Can everyone hear me in the back? Is it good? Okay, great. But first, I will tell you a little bit more about me, because I think that's useful to understand my perspective. So I have both inside and outside government experience. I started as a transit advocate when I was in grad school in Atlanta. So these pictures show the trajectory. That's a picture at the top of the release of my master's thesis from the outside. And then I did work in academia for a few years, and then I worked at the MBTA. So there's a picture of me presenting at a board meeting. I think that was a fair increase scope. That's all the cameras, and now doing this fellowship. I also have a very interdisciplinary background from my undergraduate through my graduate work, and as he's mentioned, I lived and worked in public transit internationally, so in the US, a number of cities, and then in Germany and in Santiago. All of this, I think, informs my perspective. And also, I love working in transit. We were just talking about this at lunch, so the reason I got into public transport is I realized it was in the intersection of all of these really important issues, and that it was a way to kind of make change that would impact all of, social justice and racial justice, climate and environmental issues. But then once I was working in transit, what I realized it was also something that was so applicable to everyone's lives that when you meet someone and you tell them that you work in transit, they want to talk to you, right? They want to talk to you about it, and most likely they want to complain about the transit in their city. Which I actually really like, because what that means to me is that transit is a field where we can have more collaborative public policy decision making, because everyone has direct experience and knowledge and can engage in the conversation. The comparison that I like to make with this is healthcare in the US. Everyone also has experience with healthcare, generally also bad time at it, like thinks it's horrible. But as a consumer of healthcare in this country, I don't really know how to engage in policy discussions around healthcare. When I meet someone at a party, they tell me they're a doctor or a nurse, I don't immediately tell them all of my problems. So I feel like the great thing about transportation is it is so accessible. So this is the premise for my talk today, which is how to use research as a tool for change inside of a complex government operating agency. And I underlined 4 words because it's the 4 quotes I'm going to talk about. Why is a tool for change, about complexity, about research and research design and practice, and then finally about government and what it means to be accountable to the community that you're serving. And so this is a little meta, because it's a presentation about the how to do research and not the what of the research. And so I'm going to show some results of research that we did. And I'm sure you're going to be interested in all of the details of those, because I know a room full of researchers can't resist the rabbit holes of research, but try to focus your mind on the how we did it, and we can talk about some of the details of what later. But trying to really focus us on like how to actually do the research in the context of government. All right, so why research is a tool for change. And this is essentially my value statement, and I think it's very useful to put your values explicitly up front. And I believe the value that government decisions to be value driven and data informed. And so research is a tool that we use. And that I explicitly was trying to make change that research is done for a purpose. And as a researcher, I make choices about what to prioritize, and I prioritize research that can improve equity and racial justice. And so if you see the work that I did at the MBTA, the things that I worked on were in relation to that. And those were very explicit choices that I made as a researcher. And I think it's really important that we can do research that is still has research integrity, that you don't presume the results before you start, but that you know why you're doing it and that it is informed by your values. All right, moving to organizational complexity. So I'm going to talk about operational complexity and organizational complexity, because governments are very complicated agencies, and where and how the research happens within the organization is important to whether it's effective or not. And so this is a sort of schematic, you could say, or conceptual framework of an organization. I worked actually for the Department of Transportation in Massachusetts and the MBTA at the same time. So we had decision makers who I would call the ideas people, because they didn't have bandwidth to be weighing the weeds, or they shouldn't have the bandwidth to be weighing the weeds. And then you have the operating divisions. So that was the MBTA, but also the Highway Department, and the Registry of Motor Vehicles is part of the Department of Transportation in Massachusetts. And so they're very detail oriented, need to get all the details right. And the layer in the middle, which is very important, is what I call the process people. They're the people who think about how the organization works, how information flows in the organization, is organized and flows and sort of translates. And so our research team sat in that middle layer, which was really critical because we were able to see across all of the divisions, but then also up and down. And we were able to sort of think about problems vertically and horizontally at the same time. And so our team was called the Office of Performance Management and Innovation. And we were a shared service, like I mentioned, for the MBTA and MassDOT, which means we had access to all the data, like the registry of vehicle data, the highway data, the transit data, which is very exciting as researchers. But also, we were essentially kind of like a little mini research lab slash management consultant within the organization. So we did performance data and reporting and metrics and data analysis, but also some to like identify problems, but also try to help our operating division solve problems to improve performance and our policy decision makers make decisions. So we were very interdisciplinary, and we always had like a bunch of interns and co-ops. So it really did feel like a little mini research lab inside of a government agency. What else do I want to say about it? Oh yeah, and so it was like a whole lot of fun, which you will see in a little while. So operational complexity, also critical to understand that you are working in a place that can never stop, right? Transit agency can never stop. We didn't offer service 24 hours a day, but people were working 24 hours a day. There's very low tolerance for risk or failure. So it was hard to propose change because our operating divisions had to keep operating the service every day, and they couldn't deviate from that. There's a lot of interconnected systems with a lot of unintended consequences. You might pull on a thread here and cause a problem over there without knowing it. And people are doing the best they can with the resources they have. And so part of what was really important was understanding the concerns our operating divisions had about change, where it was coming from, and building sort of trusting relationships that we weren't here to break things. Because sometimes researchers can have ideas without understanding the full consequences of them. So one example of us sort of understanding the operational complexity is we did a research study, and I've tried to put the citations for the different studies that we did, if there are papers you want to look up later. So this is a study we did to try to estimate the level of fare loss due to all-door boarding on our Green Line light rail trolleys. So we were opening all the doors for operational reasons. People were concerned about fare loss. We wanted to estimate how much fare loss was. Massachusetts state law, there's only 3 titles of MBTA employees who could ask people for their fares. So we had people whose job was called inspector. They could ask people for their fares, but they were very busy doing all the other things to keep a light rail running. So we designed this whole research study methodology around how do we sort of minimize the use we need of those particular people in our data collection effort. So 2-car trains, we had one car that just had researchers observing what people did. The other car had researchers and inspectors asking people for their fares, collecting the people's Charlie cards data that we could look up later. And so this is just an example of how we have to be very aware of not having too much of an impact on daily operations as we collect the data. And then another example is how you define reliability. So we were doing work on our performance metrics, and we wanted them to be like passenger-centered. So we went out and we gathered a lot of data from passengers about how they define reliability. Like, what does it mean for the bus to be late? How late is late? But then we had to work with our operations team to figure out, like, how do we put a definition into place that they can actually work towards, right? That they can actually try to meet. So that's different for infrequent buses that come on a schedule. For our passengers, it was very important that they don't leave early, right? If the bus says it's going to leave at a certain time at this stop, you can't leave early. But there was some window where people were like, okay, you can leave a little bit late. So how big is that window that we work out with operations? If you can't leave these types of stops early, but you this is the window you're trying to hit, versus frequent buses that are managed through headways, like what's the definition for on time for passengers, for the operating team, of how to figure out how to meet that. Bonus question, because we were still talking about this when I left this job. How do you measure the reliability of travel time on a subway line? So we completely own subway lines, so travel time is our responsibility, right? But you need to make a definition where the people who are being measured feel like they can make progress against it. And so this is an interesting example because a passenger might experience delays in travel time the same. Some of them might be caused by an operational problem. Some of them might be caused by a slow zone that's been mandated for safety reasons, and the trains have to travel slower because for a capital project or some sort of other construction work. And so you could say, well, the travel time between X station and Y station should be what's in the schedule. But if you do it that way, then every time the schedule gets changed, your performance metrics are going to go all over the place. So there's no continuity. You could say it's what's possible right now for operations to run ahead. Or you could say it's with whatever slow zones are in place, or that there shouldn't be slow zones, which is what the customer would like, right? And so we had to think about the performance metrics from the perspective of whose performance were we trying to measure, and how to make it fair for them, so that they felt like they were being measured on something that they could actually improve on. So that was another place where there was constant conversations with our operating team about how to make sure we had measures that would work, that measured passenger experience, but also that were useful for them and felt fair. So in terms of research in practice, there's sort of 2 ways to think about this aspect of complexity. We're trying to reduce the complexity in our research design, while at the same time communicate about the inevitable complexity in the data and in research. So I'm going to sort of touch on both of those in a series of examples. So the first example was we did a pilot of a pass or reduced fare pass for low-income youth that had been advocated by the community. And we were running a pilot for a year to measure the loss of fares, the cost, if we did this, the benefit to the young people, and the administrative feasibility to operate it. And so working with the community groups and the cities and towns that were helping us, we developed the whole process to figure out like, how are we going to collect the data and run this pilot. And this over here, if you can see it, is a list of like all the steps an applicant would have to go through to get from applying to actually getting their full-time reduced fare pass to the pilot. And some of those steps were just merely data collection steps because we wanted core data. But what we found when we did sort of one of my great team members did like a sort of research on the research and looked at the sort of drop-off rate between each of the steps, is that not only did the young people drop off, but in particular low-income and Black and brown young people dropped off more as we made them jump through all of these hoops to get their reduced fare pass. So the people who were trying to help kind of like exited the process because we made it particularly burdensome because of some of our research steps. So it's sort of this dilemma of how do we're in real time offering an essential service and we want to collect data, but we can't do that in such a way that is so burdensome to the people who need our services. So this is one way that we have to think about how does our research in design impact passengers. And then on the more operating side, we developed this really awesome model of bus crowding where we were looking at the, with some researchers at MIT, we were looking at how many passenger minutes in crowded conditions there were for every 15 half-hour segment on every bus route, inbound, outbound, these beautiful pictures. And we made a model of thinking about like what was causing the bus crowding, and we wrote this really great paper about it, and it won an award at TRB. But our operating people were like, we can't really quite implement this on like a daily basis, and so they sort of redid the model with a different data source to make it simpler to be able to use. So great research, not as super helpful as we wanted it to be. So another way of thinking about like how do we make sure our research is providing something that can be used by our operating division. And then in terms of communicating about research and complexity in research, we knew that not everyone wanted to read all the caveats that we had about all of our data sources and what our uncertainty was. So what we did is we used like a nested model approach. So this top is a screenshot of our performance dashboard. And if someone came and they just wanted to say like, was the subway on time? Yes, 87% of the time, okay. But if they wanted to know like, how are you defining that? You could like read the tooltip where there's a little question mark. If you're like, but how are you defining that? Then you could read the FAQs. And then if you like really wanted to know, then you could read data blog posts where we talked about all of our data sort sets and where, because we knew that people would have different interest levels depending on the audience for all of our like meeting to say, but actually in this condition type of things. But we also created this data blog as a way to communicate about uncertainty. And I think this is something that became really clear during COVID to me, that it's very hard for the government, especially, to communicate about uncertainty in data and research, right? Like we get new data, things change, our models change. We need to figure out how to communicate about that without people losing trust in science. So this was before COVID, but we set up, part of the reason why we set up the data blog was for us to be able to say like, hey, either we got something wrong and explain what happened, or we got more data and now we have a better answer to that question. So it was a way for us to talk about uncertainty, talk about all the little caveats that the person presenting the slide at the board meeting wasn't going to have time to say. Share research that we never got a chance to publicly present in some other forum, but we had just done and we wanted to talk to people about. And also because it was fun. So this was something that we created for a number of our subway stations. So you have gated subway stations. So this is what we call time friends of the station. So the boardings per half hour over the course of the day would be the percentiles you can see over the course of 3 months or something like that. And so then we had a quiz, because everyone loves quizzes on the internet, to be like, can you guess what stations these are based on the boarding patterns when you think about the land use around those stations. And so these two I picked for you today are educational related. So this one is near high school. School gets out. So like residential, people going to work, high school, people get on after school. This is their college. This is across the street from a community college. So it's like, oh, you can see the classes. So that was one of our more fun moments. But we also, so that's sort of trying to communicate about research complexity externally. We also needed to communicate to it internally, because we were an operating agency and everyone was trying to sort of manage the crisis of the day. It was very hard for our leadership sometimes to know what they were going to need in advance, and they also didn't always know how long it was going to take us to do a research project. So one of my jobs was to try to figure out, anticipate in advance what was going to be needed by our decision makers. So I would go to a bunch of meetings, see what they were talking about, and be like, aha, you're about to do X. Let me go collect some pre-data before you do that. Or you're about to have a whole bunch of, you're gonna need to make a decision, say about like, we're gonna do a lot of shutdowns of rail lines and need to bus people on buses. You're gonna need to make some decisions about that. Let me add some questions to our monthly customer survey to try to gather some data so that when you're trying to make those decisions, we already have something to show you, because research takes a long time. It's not magic, but in the daily operations, that isn't always factored in. The other side of my job was working with my team of researchers to being like, it's good enough, you can stop, right? Because I think researchers have a tendency to be perfectionists. They're like, no, but I just need, and I'm like, no, at some point we have to give these people the answer. And so that was the other side of like, how do we know when it's good enough that a decision can be made from it? All right. So this is an example of, so sometimes we would do studies, basically, we wouldn't tell people about them until they were almost done. But this is an example we called the Ridership Dissertation because it was that much work. And so we were looking at, we had noticed that ridership was going down. This was before COVID, but ridership was going down, but not equally across all of our neighborhoods. So some bus routes were still having high ridership, some bus stops were. So we wanted to do a spatial analysis of ridership at the census tract level, which is sort of what we ended up on, but to understand ridership patterns across the geography. And that took, I think, a couple of years to get done, but the results ended up providing support for needing to increase bus speeds and reliability through bus priority projects. The citation is there if anyone is interested in it. It was a really cool project. Finally, we had to be accountable to the community. We're a government agency, other decisions are being made in public, but then also in, we needed, most of the time, it was like we needed to get input on sort of what we were doing. And so I have two examples here, but one of the big takeaways is that we really need more qualitative data. We had a lot of quantitative data. We didn't have nearly enough qualitative data, and we needed to work on developing research processes that were able to integrate qualitative and quantitative data at the same time, so that we could use both in the analysis, but then also explain to the public what we were doing and sort of do the research in public. So one example was an advocate group proposed an all-night bus service. They're like, we need overnight service. We weren't sure that their service model that they presented would actually meet the demand. So we worked with them and we did a lot of research to try to understand what was actually the overnight demand in Boston for transit. And what we found, which is not surprising, is that the demand patterns are very different for, late night, midnight to 3, than from like 4 to 6, in terms of where people are traveling to and from. And so that just having one single service pattern that went overnight wasn't actually going to help people very well. So we ended up, after we did all this research, we ended up piloting 2 different services. One additional early morning service that was geared towards early morning demand, and some late night service was geared more towards late night, which worked really well. But it really took that research to show that, and this was, I have the PowerPoint up here, PDF, if anyone, this is one of the sort of like biggest presentations I did in terms of length. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there, because what we did is we knew that this is demand on the shoulders, the existing transit, but we didn't have the overnight demand for the West Coast at the time. So we mixed like data from the bike share system, taxi data we can get from the city, like all these other types of data sets together to try to figure out, or get a survey, try to figure out overnight demand. And then this is an example where a decision was made to eliminate paying in cash on board. And we had to figure out how to put a sales network throughout the community where people could add cash to the trolley card or their smart card. And we had a lot of data, but we needed a lot more data from the community. So my team was going out and doing community meetings and talking to people in different settings to try to understand the impact of this. And we really needed to do that qualitative, quantitative data at the same time. And because it was a very controversial decision, really show people what we were doing. But it also was, it was a place where where I sort of really realized that we didn't have enough sort of qualitative data infrastructure, and that we needed to work way more on our qualitative data collection. All right, so some reflections. So I think one of the really important things is understanding the types of complexity. So I talked about organizational complexity, operational complexity, complexity in research design, complexity in how we communicate about complexity. And we need to think about what type of accuracy matters for the decision that's getting made. And I think sometimes as researchers, we don't always focus on the right type of accuracy. And so what type of accuracy matters to the decision, or what type of accuracy will matter in the lever points that exist for change to be made in like operations. And then we need to plan for implementation in our research design. So if we're thinking about something, how do we think ahead to be able to think about, can whatever we're doing be implemented, but then also think about an iterative process where we're doing research, we're trying something out, we're seeing if that worked. And so then the implementation of the research becomes iterative, and we had the ability to do that because we were situated inside the agency. The relationships that we had were critical. Relationships with the community and the relationships with our operating partners. And really, we had to respect, I think a lot of people have probably heard this idea of needing to like respect people's lived experience as data coming from communities. We also had to do that for our operating partners. So understanding what the bus drivers knew and other part, and the dispatchers and other parts of the operations knew, and sort of incorporating that. And understanding how people's lives are impacted by the research decisions that we made. Whether it was at the outset or within our research plan, like I talked about for the defense. And then I said this already, but really thinking about how we collect qualitative data and the need for more qualitative skills. So I think a lot of transit agencies have done a lot of work to build up their like data science or quantitative side, have made less investment in the research skills of qualitative analysis and less investment in the data infrastructure. So if you think about the data infrastructure for quantitative data, we have these massive data sets, we have created huge databases for them, we have fields and ways that data is transferred places, but that doesn't always, all that data infrastructure might have to be sort of redesigned a little bit to think about qualitative data. And so do we need different data infrastructure, both store qualitative data, but in such a way that it can be shared? Because one of the big things that the data infrastructure gives us is the ability to do open data, to share data, not just with the public, but across agencies. And one of the things that, fast forwarding for I've did a bunch of interviews during my fellowship year and heard from community groups is that agencies come out and they ask us the same questions over and over again. And it's like, yeah, we answered that question already to the MPO or to the transit agency or to the city. You all aren't talking with each other. And part of that is we don't actually have ways to share qualitative data across agencies very well. Whereas someone would call us up and be like, hey, the city of Boston would, once a month call us up and ask for data, or the MPO would call us up and ask for data. And we would easily be able to share all of that quantitative data if it wasn't already available on our website. But we don't do that for qualitative data. We did that for quantitative data, we don't do it. And then this last part is about how we need to keep our eyes on the future and anticipate what data and research is needed to get there. And I think this is both keeping our eyes on the future, but also going back to what I said at the beginning about values. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to be? And if that's where we want to be, what research or data do we need to collect now to get there? And that it is a very intentional practice as opposed to a reactive practice. All right, now let me tell you about, and then we'll have lots of time for questions, which I'm really excited about. I can try to answer burning questions about some of the examples I gave, try to answer some of them. I've probably forgotten some of the details. So I left the MBTA in December of 2020 and have had this Leadership in Government Fellowship, which is a great opportunity to basically reflect on your service in government and think about have the time to think about the things that when you're working in government every day and it's like crisis, 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 especially for pandemic, you didn't have the time to do. And so I've been working on some projects to try to figure out how do I take all the things I thought about at the MBTA and sort of share them back. So one thing I did is I created this website called Transit Data Primer, and I just released it 4 weeks ago. And it sort of it provides a framework of transit data sets, what they can be used for, these questions around qualitative, quantitative data, and then really geared towards advocates or people who are trying to engage with transit agencies. What are the types of questions you can ask about data analysis if you feel like it's wrong or if it's not getting the answer that you know or experience? Like where could have the analysis gone wrong, or maybe you're asking something different than what people are actually analyzing. So that is available as a website and then downloadable presentation. The second thing I've been doing is I made a cooperative board game. I'm very excited. People want to stay after and play. I would love to test it. So it is about complexity in government. And so the way the board game works is 3 to 6 players. They are department heads and transit agency trying to get their projects done. So they have to sort of navigate all of the bureaucratic hoops, work together, keep the morale up in order to finish their projects. And one of the things that is critical in the board game, and I think that is often under discussed, is the role of, the board game is called morale, but basically the role of emotions in work. and how your emotional health and well-being and relationships with other people and all of those other things factor into your ability to be productive in a workplace. And that happens in government, it happens everywhere, but that essentially government is a collection of people who are running, you know, business processes and operating things and maintaining assets. But we have to remember the people part first. So that's that. And then I've been doing, and it's not done yet, but some writing on the relationship between communities and agencies at the more individual level, not the institutional level, but the individual level, of how change is made through those relationships, and how those trusting relationships are made, and then sort of change making strategies that can come out of them. So I did some interviews, like I mentioned, and I'm working on that. And this is where you can find me on the internet. My website, Friends of Data Pioneer, my email address, my Twitter. So I definitely welcome future engagement, question, comment, feedback. And I think we have lots of time for questions now.
Great, thank you. So I certainly have a few questions, but I'd love to hear from students. I'm sure lots of you guys have good questions as well. Yeah, Staley.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Great. What other kinds of like qualitative data you feel like agencies are missing? And what kind of data like do you feel like is shareable? Because like a lot of this stuff is like very project specific. A lot of that data is collected. Like, what do you think about X project? Or like what kind of data do you think is transferable?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I don't think I have all the answers, but we can talk about it. Maybe other people have some answers too. Which is whenever I've gone to one of those project meetings, right? People come and they give feedback about what is on their mind. So maybe it's about the project, or maybe it's also about the bus stop, the service, like all these other things, right? And so I think what we have to figure out how to do is sort of capture that in a way where even if the meeting was about project X, all the other feedback that's more, and some agencies are probably better at this than others in terms of having like systems where like, so my staff would go to a meeting about a project, they would get comments about something else. They would try to run down the staff member who's in charge of that other thing in order to give that pass that feedback along. So there might be some internal systems to do that, but not in a way that any one person can sort of see the big picture, right? So we had, you know, our call center, so we would be able to get like all the complaints that came in through call center or comments or Twitter. So there's different ways that agencies get in people's like direct feedback. And then, so that could be cleaned, right? You'd have to do data cleaning and sort of categorized in some way. And then, so that's sort of more of the like, input just comes in. There's the project-based meetings and feedback, trying to figure out if there's ways that you can capture that and share that so that people who are working on other projects can like at least go in and look at it and say like, when this team was talking about X project, we're doing a project next door. So one of that things that even gets back to how public input is organized in your agency, right? So are you doing public engagement at a project level where you're subbing it out to a consultant, or do you actually have a public engagement team that's building relationships with neighborhoods and they know, okay, here's all the projects that are happening in your neighborhood. So when I go out to talk to you, I can like make sure that information is getting to the right place. So I think that goes back to the organizational complexity part at the front end of like, is your organization organized such that there's like that visibility across all of the different streams, which is why a lot of transit agencies have started doing like customer engagement departments or trying to figure out a way to have something in their organization that they can sort of put their arms around all of the feedback they get in one place. But in terms of then sharing it out, I think that yeah, figuring out like what is the mechanism by which it gets sort of cleaned and then posted somewhere. And then I think the other part is the actually doing qualitative research, right? Like having people who have the skill sets, which I don't feel like I do, to do, you know, focus groups and more like ethnographies and like all the other ways that we could think about research happens to figure out how transit impacts people's lives and how we should be making decisions using that information. And that is where there are some people who are starting to work on that. We need to sort of let that work out, I think, and not just the work of the data scientists, big data, automated data set work. And that is also why it's inherently interdisciplinary as well. So long-winded answer. I don't know if other people have answers as well they want to throw out there.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that some of us were at the UCLA Arrowhead Symposium last week, and we learned there that other than metrics, like usually the metric used to measure the success of a transit line is the ridership. But it shouldn't just be that, like it should be the lived experience of the riders. So I think that could be another like thing that focus groups could be really useful.
I was interested in, you mentioned you had a monthly survey where you captured different patterns and not just the ridership. And you could tell us more about it and how did you put it forward and how was it put like, to the people where they asked for?
Yeah, so we had, I would say 4 different types of surveys. So there was, and I'll start least frequent and get to that one. So we had every 5 years, we did a big, what we call sort of census survey to gather demographics. It was like, we needed to get this sort of statistically significant demographic of the riders that for every route and every station for Title VI and MBTA. So that was like one big survey. Then we had a sort of customer satisfaction survey that we did every 2 years. That was online, but also mostly in person at stations. And there were some standard questions that we try to ask every year, and then there were some sort of new stuff we would add in. And then we had sort of one-off surveys if there was conversations that needed to be made, but we tried to get away from that. We did, and then we had a monthly panel. So the monthly panel was online, and people would sign up to be in it, and then they would be sent a survey electronically, and we would weight the monthly panel survey to the ridership. So if it was overly taken by red line riders, we would sort of do weighting to try to adjust it for ridership and for demographics back to the big statistical census survey to try to account for the fact that online only surveys do undercount folks. So that was, so the monthly survey was really helpful in that we were able to do, so we had a standard set of questions on the monthly survey that we asked every time to track some baseline, and we reported that back out on our performance dashboard, so the baseline satisfaction with a few different things. And then we did what we called a module, but basically a rotating set of questions. And some of those we did quarterly, so we would have a set of questions we would ask about. I don't remember one of them. Bus diversions was a big topic because we were doing a lot of capital work when I was still are. So we would ask that quarterly to try to gauge some things we wanted to get every time, and then sometimes we would do like a one-off, like that part where we would need some information about X, and we would do the module about that. So that was sort of how we had the ability to like rotate some things in and also still get sort of like longitudinal data from some questions, and not have it be super boring survey that's the same questions every month with the same people. And I didn't put it in here, but we had some really great researchers working on that, and they did some really great analysis of all of our survey data, trying to like learn what we could from all of them combined. the statistical survey is available online. The last one we did in like 2016, something like that, where you can go and look. There's like an interface you can go and look at the data. So we publicly presented that as like a tool that people could use. But we did a lot of internal analysis on the survey data to kind of sort of understand different dynamics. I remember one of the most interesting things we learned was that one of the biggest predictors actually of satisfaction with the MBTA was whether people agreed with the statement of the MBTA cares about its customers. I think that was how it was worded. I can't remember the exact wording, but like this concept of the MBTA caring was very important, which was sort of fascinating to figure out how do you like translate that into policy. Go ahead.
Just a follow-up question on that. Do you usually do surveys of the riders only, or is it of the entire city?
So that is a great question. When I first started, there was this idea that we would do separate. It's actually really hard to find someone in Boston who's like never written an MBTA. So who instead we sort of grouped it as like infrequent and frequent as like a difference, because a lot of people have written like to a baseball game or something like that. And so, yeah, when we were trying initially, I remember when I was first there, we like tried to do some focus groups of people who had never written it. It was even hard to find people. But I do think it's very important to get at that of the people who don't write very often.
I guess I was wondering, how do you target the respondents? Like, what's the mechanism by which you float the survey? Is it like the rider on the train that day, or is it just like a random person? Is it floated online to the city, or?
So we did it a couple different ways. The first one we did when I was there, we did go out and like try to get people in shopping centers and just like around the city. But like I mentioned, most of the people we found also were riders. And then I think the second one was much more targeted, like at train stations and bus stops. And so it was less focused on the very occasional rider. Yes.
Yeah. So, like in your presentation, you mentioned about the bus crowding model and how the outcomes of it were not actually implemented by like accepted by the agency and implemented.
Well, it was just that they reworked it to be simpler, so that like they used a different data. They switched it over from we were using an origin destination model on top of our fare collection data, and instead, as time progressed, we got enough of the automatic passenger counters on buses to start using that, and it got like way easier to sort of do the calculations. And so they sort of rebuilt it using the APC data instead of the passenger counter data instead of the AMC data.
So, with my just like a clarification question, like whenever these such kind of modeling exercises happen, like this, or whenever we talk about like fare optimization or other modeling exercises related to transit, so how often does it happen that those results are not implementable by the agency, and what kind of issues they run into in implementing these models in real life situations?
Yeah,
How to overcome those issues?
I think it probably is common that it is very hard to translate from a model to implementation in real life. I think that's why you have to think about it in advance of like how do you what are the actual lever points that you're trying to impact, and what is the outcome sort of translate to it sort of like standard operating procedure, like what is the sort of practice that you're trying to change in the modeling. I think we did there's one like other experiment that we convinced our operating department to run. I'd actually be interested in your answer to this question as well. But we convinced our operating department to run this experiment on the Green Line, which is our light rail line. It was a dispatching experiment. And in order to do it, basically, I had to promise that one of my staff members would be at the end of the line. We were doing it at 20 something hours a day. It's like a lot of work for us. But that was super instructive. So an MIT student had done a model to try to figure out oh, if we dispatch this way, I'm going to forget the details. I'm sure there are papers on this that we can look up. Then this would lead to better on-time performance or better, spacing of trains, better customer experience. And then we tried to figure out how to actually put it into practice. It was extremely difficult for many reasons, a huge learning experience for my team. The one thing I remember about this is the unintended consequences thing. So one of the things we wanted to do was have a ring off bell, which is basically a bell that the dispatcher can ring that tells the train driver to leave, right? Because we were trying to actually kind of time it out more exact on the leaving the first station of the line. So figure out how to get a bell installed. At first we got a complaint by the neighbors saying that they didn't like how loud the bell was. Then we got a complaint from passengers saying that the bell wasn't accessible because there was no visual cue. And so we had to explain to the 88 people that this isn't for the passengers, it's for the driver. You can hear it. You have to have hearing to not operate a rail vehicle. So there was just all of these things, right? That as a researcher running a model, you would never anticipate. And that's fine. But in practice, it got extremely complicated. I will say that that project sort of has turned into some sort of thinking of how do we actually kind of do better dispatching. And there were some lessons learned. The operating team sort of took some lessons from it. Our customer technology group was thinking about how they could better serve it. So there were some sort of improvements that came out of that. There was another MIT thesis project that was about bus dispatching that got turned into an actual app that street dispatchers are using in Boston. So definitely it can have those results, but I feel what's critical is the translator from the researcher and the research institute to operations, and that's effectively what my team did. We had this research agreement with MIT. They would come with all these ideas. I would be that's not gonna work. Or the operating people would be that's not gonna work. And so trying to bridge that gap was super critical. And having someone in that role, because I had been in academia and research and then was working in the agency, I was able to fill that, but it's critical. Thoughts? No?
Yeah.
So many questions. I saw back there earlier. Do you have a question?
Actually, I caught to ask the exact question that I was going to ask, so you get to it.
Go ahead.
When you're presenting research to decision makers, what info do you say and what info do you not say? And what level of detail have you found most optimal to affect change?
Yeah, this is a good question. Not sure I can answer it while being recorded. So the MBTA was actually a kind of special situation when I was there, and that we had a board that met every week. So most transit agencies don't do that. It's a little unhealthy, I would say, for an organization, but it did mean there was a lot of time, a lot more just board meeting time than a normal agency. And so I think over the course that I was there, I did almost 70 board presentations. Some of them quite long, some of them short, but that level of focus and this was coming out of a crisis. So this was in response to snowstorm, shut down the whole system, and became a crisis. They got this board in place, put a lot of focus. There's a lot of management energy spent. So that created a situation where there was a lot more space and time to present like levels of detail that I don't think are probably presented elsewhere. So my answer is probably not going to be like generalizable, but I would try to present as much detail as possible, actually, because of the sort of unintended consequences part, right? That like I didn't want a decision to be made where the intent of that decision wasn't actually going to do what they wanted because there was some additional information that was missing. And that I think was always a struggle of like both whether it was like something that like hadn't been considered beforehand, but someone had an idea, and then they're like, oh, what if we do this? And then you're like sitting in the back of the room being like, oh, I guess we go up to the podium and saying, well, but if you do that, then this will happen, right? And I did that sometimes. Not a lot of staffers did, but I felt empowered enough to occasionally go up to the podium and be like, before you decide that, let me just tell you a few more things. But I think that often people feel like staffers often feel like they can't do that, right? So it's definitely like, I think, a struggle when you are making decisions in public in real time to know how much information the decision makers need in order to make that decision. So yeah, no, it's a really good question. I don't know if I answered that, but it's hard. Yes.
I was wondering, you kind of did it earlier with the last question about the role between research and operations. And I was wondering if you've kind of developed a role within the organization that is a combination of the both, of someone who has kind of done the research or is doing research, but also very involved in operations to kind of play a very effective role for both teams. Or if you could just kind of talk about that kind of dichotomy between operations and research.
Yeah, so I was hired initially as the director of research and analysis. And that was it, basically with no job description. And so it was sort of trying to figure that out. What does that role look like? But I didn't have the operations background before. I had just been an advocate and an academic. I think someone who had more operating experience probably could maybe have done would have focused on different things. I think I focused mostly on public facing decisions because that was what my experience had been. But I think someone who had more operational experience might have focused slightly differently. But the idea was to kind of create that sort of a role. And then it was about the skill sets that were on our team, right? So we sort of tried to create a team of people who had a bunch of different skill sets, and some people sort of really specialized in some things. And so, it just happened this way, but one of my team members became, after spending many hours in the Green Line dispatching office doing that experiment, right, became the expert on the Green Line. So in some ways we also specialize because the MBTA runs ferry boats, commuter rail, trains, light rail, heavy rail, buses. Did I say boats? I said boats, right? So we had to sort of also specialize that in terms of operations as well. So I think it was a matter of figuring out what were the skills we needed, what was the sort of operational specialties that we wanted to focus on, and sort of dividing it up amongst the team. So yeah, so whenever we were doing a Green Line project, we'd be like, somebody talk to Arthur. And then also trying to build out the relationships in the operating departments to be like, if we're working on this area, who can we talk to? Who can help us figure out this is what the data is saying. It doesn't make sense to us. How is there a reason why it's wrong or something happened? So we had a lot of what we call data mysteries too, where it was this is clearly wrong, right? So how do we figure out what happened on the operating side of data go? That's another piece of skills. Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much for coming. I have a question about sort of, this is all really, really interesting, and, I think here in Yolo County, we have a very, I just want to understand better from your perspective, how this information is generalizable for really small and under-resourced transit agencies, which really don't meet weekly, and when they do meet, their decision makers aren't as well informed or capable as the MBTA, even though you're sort of implying that they weren't as capable. I just, I feel like, around here, it's even we're in murky territory in terms of people being able to receive information that could inform decision making.
Yeah, I think
Anthony and I were recently attended a meeting in which UC Davis researchers attended, gave a really fantastic presentation, and then there was 0 questions from the decision makers. I was like there, like in the Zoom, like applauding, but there was, and I felt like that spoke to the fact that the information was not particularly well heard or understood or appreciated, which was unfortunate, right? So I guess just like we're just starting from such a low place in terms of like their interest even, and it's hard to know how much of this is generalizable for our research.
Yeah, I think the difference for the MBTA and the Common Agricultural Board is the question of like what decisions are being made by your board and what decisions are being made by your general manager. And that in the case of the MBTA, we had a lot of decisions that were made by the board that normally would be made by the general manager. So that's what the weekly part was. It just like elevated a bunch of decisions that normally would have been made by them. So I think that, and then that just changes the dynamic in response to your question about like whether you're doing it in public or not, right? But I do think that ideally you have general managers really transit agencies here who do have the capacity, and so it's like which decision maker are you sending to? But I do agree with you that, and I was just telling someone this at lunch that that I think like the Bay Area or California having so many transit agencies is actually a disservice, because there isn't sort of the staff capacity and most of them to be able to be doing this work, right? And it's so disparate that I really benefited in Boston from the fact that it wasn't just that the MBTA was in crisis or ran a lot of modes, it was the transit agency, right? And so and we were connected to MassDOT, and so we had all of the research resources of the state DOT and the 5th, 6th largest transit agency in the country sort of aggregated. Whereas I feel like here it's like so spread out that makes it much harder for any agency to be able to be doing sort of this level of research work internally. And that part of me, I'm sort of hoping for like some progress on the sort of trying to figure out how to like integrate better, at least Bay Area transit agencies, with the idea maybe that would allow for some aggregation of some of this work to be done at more of a regional level. That there just not being enough big agencies that have the capacity to do it. So I agree with you. Yeah, I'm not sure what kind of model could work to sort of get smaller agencies to kind of these types of resources.
Following up on it, the other big difference between Boston and here, I also worked at the MBTA, came to Sacramento, and when I talked to people about had the same experience as Laurel, in Boston, and when I came here, I said I worked for Sacramento RT, and like nobody had any idea what that was, even though they had never written it. So there's no engagement by any of those board, the board of Sacramento RT, or certainly not the board of YOLO Bus. They've never been on a bus. They don't experience it firsthand, and it makes a really big difference.
Yeah, I think I think the fact that the MBTA is both big enough and also that it's sort of Boston that's enough that a lot of people ride transit, it becomes a political liability, right? That like transit was political liability in Boston. Like when it shut down, it was like huge disaster, right? There was 100 inches of snow, but like it was still a huge disaster. And then the governor had to take action, right? So that governance piece, I didn't talk about governance, but governance is so critical to sort of decision making and the ability to make change. The governance piece is huge. We're actually talking about this lunch too, right? Like the fact that the sort of transit system in Santiago could potentially bring down a national government did make the government pay attention to it. And so I do think that sort of political weight of transit sort of varies and can have a critical impact on how much attention we get.
Yeah, I had a question, I guess, related to the funding part, but because all this data collection is very costly in many ways. So there's also this tendency to find new ways to get the data of the users, like using phones or even a card. So like, what do you do when you really need the information, but you don't have maybe the Boston like funding to do it, and what would you recommend there? Like what's essential?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons, also one of the reasons why there isn't the investment in qualitative data. It is more expensive than sort of this automated data coming out of your system that are designed for something else, like fare collection, right? But there is significant investment in automated data, pass per counters, those types of things. Yeah, how do we make the case for better data? That's a good question. I mean, what I did when I needed data that I didn't have is hired interns to collect it. Isn't that what everyone does? But yeah, no, I mean, I think that sort of that aggregation was really critical to us. So it was because we weren't just a transit agency, we were also the DOT. So like, how do you sort of aggregate it to be like, okay, we all need this data. Like, how can we sort of go in on getting it? I think maybe it's one of the solutions. So instead of like the MPO is doing this, the transit agencies, 27 transit agencies are doing this, and that's all the cities in town. Like, is there a way to try to create some sort of like data cooperative? The university's support, right?
It's probably a somewhat irrelevant question, but I'm just curious which snowstorm it is that you're talking about that kind of changed the governance.
2015. January, February, March of 2015. And it wasn't just snow, it was also really cold as well. Like it didn't get like above 30 something degrees for a very long time. So it was the combination of the two. There also had been just been a governor's election, so there was also sort of some like need to respond politically as well. But it shaped it, but I would say that the MBTA was in crisis the entire time that I was there. It's like there's always a crisis in an old transit agency.
Just one more question. So I was wondering, how does the MBTA usually estimate demand for non-existing or proposed lines? You did mention the overnight service and that you tracked taxi service rides at night. Was that effective? Like, question is, how accurate is the estimation technique and how do you do it?
Well, the best predictor for our overnight service was looking at the ridership on the last bus of the night, right? And how did that compare? The last like couple buses of the night or last couple trains of the night. Because then you know they're already transit riders and they might want to go later and they're just getting that one the last option. But in general, I mean, so the MBTA just opened 2 weeks ago. The first bit of the green extension of the green line going the other way through Boston. The ridership projections for that were probably done many years before, many. So I don't think there's probably a good way to compare. this point. Sort of how accurate, there've been many things that have happened in the pandemic, right, in between then and now, so I just think it's really hard to compare. Yeah, I know ridership projections have to be done and they're connected to federal funding and all of these things, but yeah, the accuracy of them is a question, let's say. Because there's also this like how there's also this question of like, you know, did property values went up, housing prices changed in the neighborhood around the new green line. That changes who's living there, that changes the number of trips that they take on transit. There's all these other factors, right? That the line itself is contributing to. I don't know how, I'm not an expert in modeling, I'm not sure how those types of changes are factored in. But like, what does it say about your model if we say we built this train line and now the average population or living in this area is taking fewer transit trips than before because their incomes have gone up and they're taking the transit trips? Not a good investment to make. Go ahead.
So you talked earlier about knowing when to stop. What would you say a good sign is that you need to stop and publish?
Oh man, I think this gets to the issue of what type of accuracy is important, and understanding what type of accuracy is important for the thing that you're doing. Publishing maybe is different than implementing, right? And so that's an interesting dilemma. But we mostly published after the fact. We got enough time, had enough time to get around to it. But it would be like, some of it was we ran out of time. But some of it was, we know what direction the errors are going to be. Do we know what direction the errors are going to be? Are they going in a way such that like, what is the window on which like the same decision would be the same? Does the error range sort of go outside of that window? So those types of, and it's not an exact science, right? But it's sort of thinking about those types of questions. And I talk a little bit about this in the data primer, about sort of thinking about accuracy and what type of accuracy is important. And I feel like my thinking, it's sort of just a recent line of thinking that I've been doing and talking to some of my former colleagues on. So it's evolving, but I think it's definitely something to be thinking about. Because sometimes you do way more than you need it. Or sometimes you do it the wrong way. You try to make it really accurate in this way, and what matters is whether it's accurate or here. So, good question. Are there questions online?
I do have one online. In our suburban community, maximum transit frequency is hourly. However, program schedules are not coordinated with the transit schedule. Have you researched transit use in relation to class schedules, work schedules, program schedules that are coordinated with the transit schedule for situations where transit frequency is low?
I think that's a good sort of question for how we think about service planning. I know we attempt to think about it. Schools is a good example. In Boston now, all of the 7th through 12th graders ride MBTA to school, or they can. There's a few options depending on your situation, but they get free T-passes through the Boston Public Schools, and so definitely there was some attempt to coordinate build times with bus schedules. However, this is, classic sort of coordination problem of we make our decisions this many months in advance. They make their decisions this many months in advance. How do we make sure they line up? So I think it's about there's some amount of it is about sort of researching and understanding sort of what are the demands for a bus plan, but some of it is just also about their coordination and being able to figure out how to communicate in time for the schedules being made, because lots of bus schedules are made months in advance. I think that's like a sort of fact that a lot of people don't understand, how long it takes bus schedules to turn into buses in the street.
One last question.
You mentioned earlier the distinction between frequent and non-frequent riders in data. How did the MBTA like quantitatively define those categories and why? Is there a standard across transit agencies, or is it ad hoc each one to each one?
I don't think it's a standard across transit agencies. I don't remember what the cutoff was, but I'm pretty sure that the amazing data analysts who worked for me did some analysis to try to figure out like when they saw general different like opinions and different behaviors, sort of then decided on a cutoff that we use, that we then standardized in our analysis, but I can't remember off the top of my head what it was. I'm pretty sure that they sort of did some work to figure out what that would be in terms of whether it was about opinions or about sort of decision making. It also got tricky because we would have people who only rode commuter rail versus people who rode multiple modes. So that also weighed into our sort of thinking about different rider classes, was like what type of modes they rode, because the experience is very different from commuter rail rider to a subway rider or a subway only rider. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I learned a lot just from her shaking her head. To the ad hoc.
I think there's a lot that isn't standardized across transit agencies. You have the National Transit Database, which is a lot. But then beyond that, and the GTS, but beyond that, there's a lot that's standardized across. There's like a joke. You've seen one transit agency, you've seen one transit agency. Peter, I'll credit that to Peter Rock, who used to be the MBTA administrator, that's now transit. Yeah, there's many transit agencies, and I think the fact that the governance and the funding structure is different than all of them also has an impact on why they're not.
Well, this has been such a great discussion. Good questions, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm sure Laurel is excited to share the game Transform Transit with everyone, and I'm sure I'll be able to answer questions as well if you guys want to stick around a little bit. Let's thank her one more time for